Hello.
Good morning.
Well, for us,
Yeah, yeah,
we've been over
so
it. Might not be morning for them.
that's true. Especially since I sometimes post these in the evenings after I get up.
Yeah. Good evening.
Um, we're looking at the next prayer in Job, and it starts in Job 9, verse 25, kind of ish, and goes all the way through chapter 10 and verse 22, kind of ish, maybe. Um, we'll talk a little bit about where it begins and ends,
Yeah.
or what parts are what. But anyway, pay attention as we read through this. We're going to read it all through at the beginning here. As we read through, pay attention to the pronouns that Job uses, because they kind of give us clues as to where he's headed with it. And we're just going to swap off, taking turns reading a sentence. So,
All right.
go ahead, Xander, and get us started.
All right. My days are swifter than a runner. They flee away. They see no good.
They go by like skiffs of reed, like an eagle swooping on the prey.
If I say, I will forget my complaint, I will put off my sad face and be of good cheer. I become afraid of all my suffering, for I know you will not hold me innocent.
I shall be condemned. Why then do I labor in vain?
If if I wash myself with snow and cleanse my hands with lye, yet you will plunge me into a pit, and my own clothes will abhor me.
For he is not a man as I am, that I might answer him, that we should come to trial together.
There is no arbiter between us who might lay his hands on us both.
Let him take his rod away from me, and let not dread of him terrify me.
Then I would speak without fear of him, for I am not so in myself.
I loathe my life. I will give free utterance to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul.
I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me.
Does it seem good to you to oppress, to despise the work of your hands, and favor the designs of the wicked?
Have you eyes of flesh?
Do you see as man sees?
Are your days as the days of man, or your years as a man's years, that you seek out my iniquity and search out my sin? Although you know that I am not guilty, and there is none to deliver out of your hand.
Your hands fashioned and made me, and now you have destroyed me altogether.
Remember that you have made me like clay, and will you return me to the dust?
Did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese?
You clothed me with skin and flesh, and knit me together with bones and sinews.
You have granted me life and steadfast love, and your care has preserved my spirit.
Yet these things you hid in your heart. I know that this was your purpose.
If I sin, you watch me and do not acquit me of my iniquity.
If I am guilty, woe to me.
If I am in the right, I cannot lift up my head, for I am filled with disgrace and look on my affliction.
And were my head lifted up, you would hunt me like a lion and again work wonders against me.
You renew your witnesses against me and increase your vexation toward me. You bring fresh troops against me.
Why did you bring me out from the womb?
Would that I had died before any eye had seen me, and were as though I had not been carried from the womb to the grave.
Are not my days few?
Then cease and leave me alone, that I may find a little cheer before I go. And I shall not return to the land of darkness and deep shadow, the land of gloom like thick darkness, like deep shadow without any order, where light is as thick darkness.
Okay, that's
So, yeah, that's, well, he said he was going to not forget, he was going to just pour out his complaint. So
yeah.
he gave free utterance to his complaint there,
Yeah.
no doubt. And again, we see, Job is not afraid to tell God how he really feels. The thing about it is, God knows how we feel.
Yeah.
We couldn't hide it from him if we wanted to, so we might as well be honest with him and let him know how we're feeling. And that's what Job does here. But again, similar ideas to some of the things we looked at in the last video. He talks about how swift his days are going by like a runner. He talks about how fast things are moving in his life, how quickly it's going by. And Job lived more than 200 years of life, probably. Now, we don't know exactly how old he was at this point where he's concerned about the end of his life coming on him. But he had a much longer life than most of the rest of us do. And so it's interesting that he talks about how short and how quick his life's going by when he has a longer life than a lot of us. Of course, he may not at this point. He could still be fairly young. He has 10 children that are all grown, so that would put him upwards of 50 years old, but and maybe even much older than that, depending on what age he married and started having children and so forth. But he is not happy with the things that are going on in his life, and he turns his anger toward God. But it is interesting how, did you notice in there, sometimes he's talking to God very clearly. He says, you this and you that. And then other times he does. He changes over to say he. Mm-hmm. And he starts talking as though God's another person, that he's complaining to God about God or something.
And that is, we need to remember that Job's not alone in this. He has his friends there next to him.
Right.
So I think in his complaint, he is often going to swap back and forth between, oh, God, I have to complain to you about this. Oh, my friends, God is doing this to me, so let me complain to you about what God is doing. And I think that's very, like, in 28 through 31, that seems directed to God. And then in 32 to the end of chapter 9, in 35, I believe that is he swaps back and addresses his friends. And it's interesting, he continues to address his friends through the end of chapter 10. Because the way he starts off his prayer in verse 2 is him telling them, I'm going to speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God. And then he goes through all of his complaints.
He's telling his friends what his prayer to God is.
He's telling his friends what his prayer to God is. And it's very interesting because how often are you going to have a prayer like that? Yeah. And for that matter, is this a prayer? Because it's things that are addressed to God, but they're not addressed directly to God. Yeah. He's telling them to someone else. And of course, God hears.
Well, that's why I say some of this, it's, kind of confusing as to when he's praying to God and when he's talking to his friends. Yeah. And when he's telling his friends what he's going to pray to God.
Yep.
And I don't know. Is all of that from verse 2 where he says, I will say to God, is all the rest of that then just him telling his friends what he wants to say to God? It's possible that the whole thing is. It's possible at some point he actually just starts talking to God. But it's certainly an interesting thing. I think the closest thing to this elsewhere in the scriptures is probably when Paul in some of his letters tells the people he's writing to, I thank God on every remembrance of you, or something like that, or I pray to God thanking him for your faith, or that your faith is known throughout the world, different things.
Where it's like, it's not a prayer, but it's talking about,
a prayer. It's talking
when
about
I pray, this is what I pray.
Right. It's kind of like when Jesus gives the sample prayer in the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, okay, when you pray like this. Yeah. Here's what you should say when you pray.
It's like he wasn't praying, but he was
teaching them how to pray, what to pray about.
It's interesting.
Yeah, so, but it is an amazing thing. And, of course, like you said, God heard all this. There's no doubt about it. That he hears all these things that Job is saying about him.
And you can tell that God hears all this because when, spoiler alert, God shows up later and decides to talk to Job.
Job 42:10.
When God shows up and starts talking to Job, he mimics Job's style in this section just by asking a lot of questions that are, obvious isn't the word, but it's like through here Job is asking a lot of like rhetorical questions.
Right.
And when God shows up, he asks a lot of questions that aren't exactly rhetorical, but prove the point that Job is
can't
not
answer the
God.
questions. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. It's a nice final bit to the entire, if we view this as a poem, because it's Hebrew poetry, it's a nice final bit to the poem that mimics back to the beginning of when Job starts to voice his sufferings,
Right.
but on the other side of things. And I think it's a beautiful touch that I've certainly never noticed before.
Yeah. And I count 9 questions in this section.
Yeah.
9 different questions that he asked. And like you said, most of them, he's not actually looking specifically for an answer. He's just kind of saying, I can't believe this is the case. Or
Right.
even, he says, do you have eyes of flesh? Do you see as a man sees? Well, the answer to that is obviously not.
No.
So it is kind of a rhetorical question. But then just before that, he says, does it seem good to you to oppress, to despise the work of your hands and favor the designs of the wicked? And no, God doesn't favor the designs of the wicked, and that's not what he's doing here. Job doesn't know what he's doing. Job doesn't understand what's really going on because all he's seen is his own suffering.
Right.
But certainly he does know that this is God's plan, and he says as much. He knows that that this is what God's purpose was in verse 13 of chapter 10. Yet these things you hid in your heart, I know that this was your purpose. He doesn't understand it, but he knows that God's in control of all these things that are happening. And he's not happy about it. He's very upset about it. He's just even asking, why did you even bring me out of the womb? Why was I even born if it was going to be to suffer like this? There are just so many times that he goes through that same kind of thing. I'd been better off dead. I wish I hadn't been born. I curse the day of my birth. All these kinds of things that he says over and over again. We saw that in the last prayer that he was saying, I wish I was dead. I'd love to die right now because I'm so miserable. And so this is a constant thing with him, that he's dealing with all of these sufferings. He says in verse 1 of chapter 10, I loathe my life. I'm so miserable. And he talks about the bitterness of my soul. And then he says, let me know why you contend against me. Why are you treating me this way? And God does. But again, in Job 42 and verse 10, it says, the Lord turned the captivity of Job. When he prayed for his friends, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. So God turned it around for him. But during the time that he's going through this deep valley, he does not understand why. Why is God doing this to him? And why are you... He says, you fashioned me, and now you've destroyed me. What are you doing? Why are you doing it this way?
I love extrapolating on the start of verse 18. Why did you bring me out from the womb? This idea of, if you were going to let me be born and give me a life and everything was going to be good or bad or whatever, well, why bother to do it if you're just going to end everything before my time,
Yeah.
It would have been better off if I'd never lived in the first place.
Yeah, and there in verse 12, you have granted me life and steadfast love, and your care has preserved my spirit. So he recognizes all the good that God has done for him in his life, but then he turns around and says, well then, wait, why are you trying to
Right.
destroy me now.
And I know we haven't gotten to it yet, but Job always reminds me of Lamentations, because in Lamentations,
A lot of sorrow.
There's a lot of sorrow, but in Lamentations, the sorrow, the pain, is directed towards God,
right,
as well. And then halfway through Lamentations chapter 3, it's like, well, you've done all this to me, to my people, but you're the only one I've got, so I'm gonna I have to love you anyway, and not necessarily in a depressed way, but in a joyful way, because we know he gives and he can take away, but if he takes away, he can give it right back whenever he wants to.
Yea, though he slay me, and even if he destroys us, even if he kills us, we'll still serve him, we'll still love him.
Yeah.
And that's over and over again. I do like some of the imagery, when he talks about, didn't you pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? He's just like, these things you're doing to me, you knit me together, and yet now you're destroying me, and you're watching me, if I sin. And this is probably one of the saddest verses of all the things that Job has to complain about. This is probably the saddest one right here.
Yeah.
When he says in verse 14, "If I sin, you watch me, and do not acquit me of my iniquity. If I am guilty, woe to me."
And it's like, that's okay.
We're all guilty, though, is the problem. We're all guilty, and so woe to all of us.
Yeah.
For that. And if he says, "And you will not acquit me," you won't forgive me of my sin.
And
what a sad circumstance that is for him to feel that way.
And I think that's something that we all need to really understand about God, is like, his forgiveness is a gift of love. And love is an integral part of who God is. But it's like I think about sometimes, the sacrifice that he made to send Jesus to die on the cross for all of us to have a chance at forgiveness.
He didn't have to do that.
He didn't have to do that.
Jesus didn't have to do that.
Because alongside his love, God is a just God. And justice demands punishment for how we have wronged him.
And he could have just punished us all.
Yeah.
That's what we deserved.
Yeah. And
every one of us.
It's wonderful to know that he is a loving, caring God, not just a God of justice. Because without that love, we're sunk. Without any hope of anything good.
And that he would pour his wrath out upon himself rather than
us.
on us.
Yeah.
And that's phenomenal to think about. There's just no way to compare that to anything else.
And I think about
world
when Paul talks about God receiving us as an adoption of sons.
Yeah.
He poured his wrath and his justice out on his one truly begotten Son for the sake of those he was trying to adopt.
You would have liked that, right? If I had poured out some wrath and judgment on you and then adopted another kid and loved them.
And you think about that as well, how much Jesus himself has to love us, because he didn't just die for us. He didn't just suffer through that pain. He went through...
He left heaven.
He left heaven. He went through the Father's wrath and separation just so that we could have not even a certainty, a chance for some of us.
Yeah.
Because, it's like, well, okay, if I do this and I know I'm going to get, or I know that I'm getting everybody.
Right.
I'm doing this for everybody and I'm going to get everybody. That's one thing. But it's like, that's not how that works.
Yeah.
And Jesus himself said that's not how that works.
Yeah, and it must have been rough, too, especially being on earth as he's looking to that is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And then he's being constantly rejected by people, and they're turning away from him. They're not listening. And then, to know that that's what I'm going to do this for is so people can reject me.
I can't imagine, I don't think anyone can, how frustrated and depressed as a human he would have had to have been. Well, knowing that everything he was doing, everything he was saying, it was for their good.
And yet
so many were just not going to listen to him.
And I think you see some of that frustration in John 6:66 and following, where it says after he had taught them and taught them and taught them, and tried to he was talking in that chapter to the Jews that believed on him. He wasn't talking to the Pharisees and Sadducees and stuff. These were the Jews that believed in him, and he preaches to them and he tries to explain to them about how he's going to give his life for them, and they have to partake of his flesh and blood in order to get this life, and they can't understand it. And then in verse 66 it says that so many of them left and quit following him after that. And then he turns to the disciples, the 12, and he says, are you going to go away too? You can just see the frustration that he's just like, everybody's abandoning me. Are you going to leave too? And
I also think of
had to be comforting when Peter said, where would we go? You're the one that has the words of eternal life.
Yeah.
That had to be the best thing Peter said the right thing right then.
Oh yeah.
Didn't always, but then he nailed it.
I also think of the section where he's talking about, when I come back, will I find anyone...
Yeah, will I find any faith on the earth?
Is anyone going to actually be accepting of me by the time it's time for judgment? And that's both a sad and a terrifying thing, because I look at all of us that are saying we're Christians, saying we're religious, whatever, and I wonder how many of us... If he came back right now, how many of us would he judge as...
How many really are?
Okay, And I know some of that is, we're not going to be able to be okay on our own. That's the whole point of faith. We have to have that connection to him. But even then, how many of us have a strong enough faith to pass that judgment? How many of us rely on him enough? And
he made it clear that most people won't.
Yeah.
He talked about the wide gate and the narrow gate, and he said many are going to go this way, and only a few are going to go that way.
Absolutely.
So it's, but for Job, who's one of the most righteous men that ever lived, for him to feel like God doesn't acquit me of my iniquity, God doesn't forgive me. He's offering these sacrifices every day. He's trying to live righteously and follow God and trust God and love God, and yet he still feels like God doesn't forgive me of my sin.
And I think that was an important realization, because, as is talked about in the New Testament, the blood of bulls and goats could not atone for sins.
Right.
So he's making these sacrifices and he's trying to live righteously, but it's not going to be enough.
Right.
He's right. He wasn't being acquitted of his sin because the true sacrifice hadn't happened yet. So he's just pushing it back, doing the best he can.
Yeah.
But it's kind of scary to me that, he was on the right track. That he was doing the best he could, but he still wasn't being completely forgiven. Not in the way we are with Jesus' blood.
Yeah.
And it's crazy to me that he was right.
And he just, at one point here toward the end, he begs that God would just leave me alone.
Yeah.
Just let me have a little bit of happiness before I die.
Right.
Just a little bit, and he has no idea what God has in store for him.
Yeah.
That God is going to bless him to see his a whole nother group of children. He lost the first 10, but he's going to get 10 more children. His daughters are going to be the most beautiful in the land. he's going to have those children and see their children and their children's children and the great grand all the way to the fourth generation. He's going to get to live to see all of that without this suffering again. And so he has no idea how much God is going to bless him. And we know, none of us do. We don't realize how much God has blessings for us if we'll just make it through the difficult times and not give up.
Yep.
But yeah, he's and he talks about death, the way he describes death. Before I go, and I shall not return, for I go to the land of darkness and deep shadow, the land of gloom like thick darkness, like deep shadow without any order, where even light is as thick darkness. That's the way he describes death, the grave. It's quite a description.
I would love to know verse 21 and 22 in Hebrew, because the way the repetition there is in English,
right,
that has to be such a clever, beautiful phrasing in Hebrew.
I'm sure it is.
That just doesn't translate over.
Right.
Just because of how he repeats the words with slightly different phrasing, that's got to be.
Yeah, it's got to be very poetic.
Thing.
A very poetic section, for sure. Well, this was a very, very long section, and we tried to keep the time down.
We tried to summarize it a little bit.
There's certainly a lot in there probably that we didn't even touch on.
Oh, absolutely. Because I wandered off into the New Testament for about 10 minutes.
Well, that's okay. I mean, it is connected. I mean, we see Job's suffering, and later he talks to his friends about the fact that there is a Redeemer coming.
Mm-hmm.
That he looks to the future. He sees that. And so certainly looking to the New Testament fits very well with the message of Job.
And it does make you think as well. Job was just being tested. He wasn't actually facing the wrath of God. Jesus did.
Yeah.
Which is sad, but it's also a wonderful blessing for us. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so sad to think about people rejecting Jesus or refusing to obey him. Well, that's too hard, or that's asking too much.
Yeah.
Look what he did for us.
Right.
Nothing he asks us to do would be too much.
Yep.
It would be impossible for him to ask too much from us. And yet, going to church all the time, that's too much. Let me read the Bible. I don't have time for that. Or, I don't. Well, I know I do some bad things, but Jesus will just have to understand that's how I am, and that's the way I was made. He made me this way. No,
I've heard that one a lot before.
Oh yeah, he just got to understand that's the way I am. No, he calls you to not be that way anymore. He calls on you to come to him and be like him.
Yep.
And he died for us so that we could be freed from sin and not keep living enslaved to it.
Yep.
And just to think that there are people who,
and how
so many of us that just want to,
even like if you're one of those people that wants to try and set their religion off to the side, how beautiful is that he gives us a greater power to be able to change ourselves.
Yeah.
Because there's so many people that are trapped in, even if it's not sinful, they're just trapped in habits or patterns of things that aren't necessarily good for them or the people around them. And God, if we focus on him, he gives us a greater power to be able to change ourselves and to get away from things, even if it's not wrong or evil or sinful, because it helps us look at ourselves differently.
Yeah. Well, the old saying is, the enemy of the best is not always the worst. Sometimes the enemy of the best is the good enough.
The good enough.
And a lot of people, oh, my life's good enough.
I'm good enough.
No, good enough's not good enough. We want to reach for the best.
And then
Strive to be the best that God wants us to be the best. He doesn't want us to be lukewarm like the Laodiceans.
And then when you get into the good enough, then you've got the, well, that's not that bad.
Right.
So I don't want to put the effort in to try and do anything about that. It's not that
I'm
bad.
not as bad as that other guy over there.
Oh yeah.
At least I'm not doing that thing that person's doing.
Yep.
Instead of looking at what God wants us to do.
Yep.
Yeah, Job, he's having a rough time of it. And he says, oh, I'm going to forget my complaint. I'll put off my sad face. I'll be of good cheer.
And then I get scared that I'm just going to get hurt even more.
Yeah. And then you know what?
Poor guy.
I can't. I'm going to just do better.
I always wonder how the book of Job would have gone if he had known what was going on.
If he had the
like,
curtain pulled back.
Yeah. How would his words and everything be different if, the day before God had given him a vision and was like, hey
Job, here's what's going to happen to you.
Satan wants to test you, to pull you away from me. Don't worry about it. I still love you. I'm still with you.
Yeah.
But you're going to go through some difficult times. I wonder.
I don't know. Maybe it would have made a difference, but I don't know. Jesus told Peter that Satan had asked to sift him as wheat, and that he was going to deny him 3 times.
Yeah.
And Peter's, oh no, I'm not. Yeah, you did. Even after Jesus told him what was going to. So I don't know. Maybe it wouldn't have made much of a difference, but maybe it would have been helpful.
It reminds me of those shows where, some disaster happens and somebody time travels back and they're trying to warn all their friends and they're like, hey, this is going to happen. It's going to be awful. And they're like, well, you're crazy. Well, that would never happen. And, stuff like that. And it's like, how many times has God tried to do the exact same thing where he's like, I know the future. Yeah. This will happen. Don't do this. And we're just like, we want to live the way we want to live.
Yeah. I mean, God told Noah, the flood was coming.
Yeah.
All the people, flood's coming. What do? They just look at the idiot that's building a boat in the middle of the dry land instead of going, wonder why he's doing that.
At least somebody listened to him that time.
Yeah.
Would have been...
Not many.
None of the rest of us would be here if it wasn't for that.
Yeah. But it is common. All right, so we will look at another prayer from the book of Job next time, and hope you've enjoyed this one. And be honest with God. Tell him how you really feel, because he already knows anyway.
Yep.
So you might as well be honest with him about it.
And it's one of those things...
your complaint.
If you try and hide that from God, eventually you're going to wind up hiding it from yourself, too. And then even you aren't going to know how you feel, and you're going to have to go digging around trying to figure out why everything's happening.
The way they're happening.
Yep. And turns out you were the problem all along.
We are our own worst enemy.
Yeah. We cause a lot of problems for ourselves, for sure.
That's for sure. All right, well, have a good one, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.